Shalom, and welcome to What the Watchman Sees, a ministry that will sift through all of the social media noise to show you news of importance from the Most High's perspective. As watchmen, we are here both to warn of dangers and give biblical answers for dwelling in the secret place of the Most High during these times of confusion. Tell your family and friends to like, share, and subscribe as we delve into what Yahweh has for us, the apple of His eye. Let's get to work. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're going to use our meditation time to talk about one of the broader themes of the scriptures. We've been talking about some of the specifics. So on this Shabbat, we're going to be looking at that meta-narrative that you've heard me talk about on other occasions. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so in the meta-narrative, we've been given the information that the Most High, when He created the heavens and the earth, He had a specific purpose in mind for His creation. And in essence, the creation was to replicate the kingdom of heaven on the earth. So everything that we saw in Genesis, especially in the first couple of chapters of Genesis, had to do with that. But we didn't talk very much about how all of that is connected from Genesis to Revelation. We're going to be looking specifically at this place where the Father had mankind to begin. So we're going to be walking through the place of communion that the Father in heaven established for Himself and His creation. So as we go with that, we start in Eden, but then we're going to be looking at how that continues to be His objective. In other words, to be in fellowship with human beings so that human beings can reproduce Himself, really. Okay, so we're going to be looking at these three areas: the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle or temple. Of course, they're separated by thousands of years and hundreds of pages of biblical text, but they have the same DNA. Each one is a meeting place between our Heavenly Father and His creation, or God and humanity. And each one contains a tree or a press or a veil, and each one tells one part of this meta-narrative, this larger story. So by the end of this presentation, hopefully you'll be able to see the trajectory that we have been on since the creation and moving into the coming, soon to come, kingdom in its fullness. So that's what we're going to be talking about during this session. Okay, so why three places and why are they together? Well, in a sense, let me begin with the rarely stated reality that the Garden of Eden was on the top of a mountain, and in Mesopotamian as well as African tradition, whenever human beings envisioned a relationship with the Most High God, mountains are talked about, and the place of paradise or the place of the garden is on the top of those mountains. So that being the case, those three places, those three gardens, in a sense, including the Holy of Holies, which we're going to talk about, with its gold-plated cherubim and budding almond rod, is described as Eden reimagined in fabric and gold. So basically, the top of the mountain is the pinnacle of mankind. And so Eden was where all of that was to start. And then, of course, we know that there was something that happened. So after what happened in Eden took place, then Gethsemane becomes important because that's the turning point and the cost of fixing actually what happened in the Garden of Eden. And then that Holy of Holies is the sort of architecture in between those two things. So we're not looking at it necessarily in a chronological sense. We're looking at it in terms of a functional sense. So the Holy of Holies is that architecture that's in between the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. So when it comes to the Garden of Eden, this is where humanity walked with the Most High. And it says in the cool of the day. And then what humanity did was to walk away. And so that first sanctuary was actually a garden. The first sanctuary, the first place of communion was a garden. And the first loss was access to that garden. And that's then when we look at Gethsemane in Matthew 26 and Luke 22, we know that Adam was the first man. The second Adam was sent to mitigate what happened from the first Adam. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this Garden of Gethsemane, and it has to do with turning around of the disobedience that happened in the Garden of Eden. And then the third place, the Holy of Holies, is where the veil was between the presence of the Most High and the Most High's creation that he wanted to bring back into fellowship with himself. But he couldn't do it because of sin until what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you remember in the scriptures, when Yeshua was crucified, it said that the curtain was torn in half, the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the holy place. That curtain was torn into from top to bottom, meaning that the distance between the Most High God and his creation had been bridged. Okay. And that's what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. All right. So that's why we're looking at those three places. So let's look again at that first sanctuary. It was a walled garden in the east of Eden. So Eden was bigger than the garden. The garden was actually east in Eden. And it was watched over by the man and the woman who were to be the priest of that garden. Genesis 2:15 says Adam was placed there to work it and to keep it. And those same verbs were used for the priest who were serving in the tabernacle and in the temple. They were there to work and to keep the order of the temple. So in Genesis 2, verses 8 and 9, it says, "And the Almighty Elohim planted a garden in Eden in the east, and the tree of life was in the midst of that garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." That's something that we don't always remember. Both of those trees were in the garden because that's where human beings had been placed. Okay, so Eden was the first sanctuary, and the Hebrew verbs for what Adam was to do there, avodah, which means to work, and shamar, which means to keep, are the same verbs used later for the Levitical priest serving in the tabernacle. Adam wasn't just a gardener, he was a priest in a temple garden, walking with the Most High in the cool of the day. And you know from reading it that at the center of that garden was the tree of life. So everything to keep and sustain life was already in the garden. Now beside the tree of life was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. which is what Adam was told not to eat of that tree, but all the other trees he could eat of. So the whole garden was permitted, but only one fruit was withheld, and that's the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Eden is actually not about restriction at all. It's about trust. So then what happened at that tree? Talking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the things that were lost were communion with the Most High, innocence, because once they took of that tree, they were aware of good and evil. Access to the tree of life was lost, and life itself was lost. All that happened in the garden when the man and the woman partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the fall that happened is not just moral failure, it's a relational catastrophe. And it broke those four things: the communion with the Heavenly Father, their state of innocence, their access to life, and then life itself. In other words, that's where death then begins to have reign on the earth. Because before that, death did not have an inroad to the earth. So everything from Genesis 4 onward is Yahweh working to undo all those things that were lost in the garden: the tabernacle, the temple, the prophets, the incarnation. All of it is the Most High reaching back across the threshold, if you will, that humanity crossed when we partook of that tree, which is why there had to be another garden, or there had to be another Adam to undo what the first Adam did. So we're talking about the garden in Gethsemane. Gethsemane is an Aramaic word, and it literally means oil press. By the way, we hear in Bible studies that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew because people spoke Hebrew, and then the New Testament was written in Greek. That's partly true, but by the time that Yeshua has come on the scene, the people in Judea actually spoke Aramaic and did most of their writing in Aramaic, which is why, if you heard what I said earlier, Gethsemane is an Aramaic word. And that word literally means oil press. So the oil press was in an enclosed olive grove on the slope of the Mount of Olives. You've heard about the Mount of Olives, where Yeshua went to pray that prayer where he sweat drops of blood. Okay. In that grove, the olive press, which is what Gethsemane means, is where olives were crushed under a stone so that the oil could be gotten from it. One of the scriptures in Matthew 26:39, when Yeshua was in that second garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, "Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." So that cup that he was to take was the cup that would eventually reverse the curse that Adam allowed to come into the world. Okay. So in the first garden, man said, "My will, not yours." In the second garden, the Son of Man says, "Not my will, but yours." And that's in Luke 22, verse 44. And that's where it says his sweat became like great drops of blood. In other words, he was in utter agony. Okay, so this is a picture of an olive press. You see those big stones there. They would put the olives in that trough and then roll those stones over the olives. Okay. And actually, as it says here, there were 3 pressings of the olives that took place. The first pressing produced the pure oil. That particular oil was used to anoint kings priests, and prophets. The second pressing, using a heavier stone, was oil for the lamps, which were used to light the temple itself. And then the third pressing, the crushing weight, the heaviest, was oil mixed with the pulp, and that was used for sacrifice. So that Garden of Gethsemane, that's what was going on when on a regular basis. Okay. And so all of those things, Yeshua was being anointed as king and priest. He was used and continues to be used as a light in the temple of the Most High, and we are that temple. And the crushing weight, the oil mixed with the pulp, was used as his sacrifice. So in other words, he was bruised, he was crushed for us so that he became the sacrifice that the Most High accepted. So that's the image of the oil press. Two heavy stones, one on top of the other, the olives in between, the juice that comes out of its dark and red at first. It looks like blood before it clarifies into golden oil. This is the picture Gethsemane was meant to give us. Yeshua is the olive. The garden is the press. The cup is what comes out of him underneath that weight. That weight itself is our sin. And so those three pressings of an olive in antiquity correspond in a way to what happened to the Messiah as he's anointed as priest and king. He becomes the light of the world and finally is crushed completely as the sacrifice. The press is not punishment by accident. It is purposeful. Isaiah saw it 700 years before when he said he was crushed for our iniquities. Now, some of our Bibles read bruised, but the actual word is crushed. And by the way, back in Genesis chapter 3, when the Most High is talking about conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent strikes the heel of the seed of the woman, and the heel of the seed of the woman crushes the seed of the serpent. It's that same idea. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the temple. And this is the part that we don't hear a lot about. But the temple, or the tent of meeting, was the spiritual representation of the Garden of Eden. So in a sense, it was Eden in a tent. The tent became the temple. The design, it was a 15-foot cube of pure gold behind a veil woven with cherubim, those creatures that had wings. Okay. The Ark of the Covenant was there, which included the budding almond rod. That was the rod. It's called Aaron's rod. That was the rod when all 12 tribes were told, bring your leaders, give them a rod, and the rod that buds and begins to have leaves on it. Whoever has that rod is appointed to be the priestly tribe of this nation. And so Aaron's rod is in that Holy of Holies place. A jar of manna, meaning an example of how the Most High takes care of the needs of his people. And then, of course, the tablets, which contained the covenant, the life, the provision, the word of the Most High, were all hidden behind that curtain. And human beings, that's where the Most High would meet with humans, but human beings couldn't come in there. And the only one who could come in there was the high priest, and he could only go in there once a year. So that shows you how restricted our access to the Most High was up until that point. But it still represented Eden, because it was the same thing with the garden. When men when man and woman were removed from the garden, they couldn't get back in there. There were cherubim guarding the way into the Garden of Eden, just as there were cherubim guarding the Holy of Holies in the tent of meeting and in the temple. The key scriptures in Exodus 26:31 and 33, where it says, "You shall make a veil with cherubim skillfully working into it, and the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy." So that's in essence what I was just talking about. So the Holy of Holies is the strangest room in the Bible, but it actually represents the garden. It's a perfect cube, walls and floor of gold, and it sits behind a heavy embroidered curtain. Inside is the Ark of the Covenant, and on top of the Ark is the mercy seat with two cherubim, the same kind of beings who you remember were stationed at the east of the garden to guard the ways to the tree, or to guard the way to the tree of life. This is intentional. The tabernacle is a portable Eden. Inside the ark are three objects that retell the Edenic story in reverse: a jar of manna, food that doesn't fail; Aaron's rod that budded life from dead wood; and the tables of the law, the word humanity broke in the garden. But only one man, the high priest, could pass that veil, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, and only if he came in with blood. The veil says you may come this close and no closer. So, what's the point of all this? It's one story told three times, okay? So this is a graphic depiction of it. So the heart and soul of the gospel, or the meta narrative of the Bible, is what we see here. The first row, the threshold. In every garden, there is a boundary object, a tree, a press, a veil. Each one represents the same question: will you accept the Most High's terms, or the Most High's word? So that if you look across the row with the threshold, that's what that represents. The second row, the figure. Adam grasps, Christ surrenders. The high priest stands between. Notice the high priest is temporary, the annual picture of what Christ does once for all. Up to that point in time, when our Messiah sacrificed himself, the Day of Atonement happened once a year, which meant that it wasn't complete because they had to keep doing it. Once Christ sacrificed himself, that was the end of it. The third line, the cost. The cost was fruit, the cup that we talked about in the garden, the blood, and that currency just kept escalating. So the fruit was the forbidden fruit that was not supposed to be eaten. The cup was the cup of wrath that had to be drunk. And of course, when the cup is drunk, the blood that is offered is the result. And then the guard, the fourth row, the guard, we're still talking about the garden. The same cherubim, three locations. In Gethsemane, the angel doesn't bar him. He actually strengthens him to keep going. But in the garden, the cherubim are there to make sure the man can't get back in there without coming through the will of the Father. And that is also what happens in the tent of meeting, or the temple. Man can't get in there except through the will of the Father. In Gethsemane, the angels don't bar Yeshua. They actually come and minister to him, or strengthen him so that he could keep going to the cross. And then finally, the outcome in the first case with Edom, the communion has been broken. In Gethsemane, the communion has been bought. That's what Yeshua was crushed for. And then in the Holy of Holies, the communion is now opened. And that's in Matthew. That's after Yeshua presents his blood. So, but in each case, the outcome in Eden, the outcome in Gethsemane, the outcome of the Holy of Holies is listed here so that we can see why each one had to happen. But the end result is that the way back to the Father is now open again. So to put it in plain English, those cherubim, because of Yeshua, that are guarding the Garden of Eden, which still exists. The Garden of Eden was never destroyed, but the way into that garden has been bought and paid for by Yeshua. So that way is open. Okay, so we talked about this briefly, but the veil being torn. This is where every thread we've been tracing converges into one moment. And we're talking about Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. Okay, so on the cross, Matthew tells us the veil of the temple is torn in two. In other words, when Yeshua died, the moment that he died, that veil got torn in two from top to bottom. And the direction matters. Human beings could not have torn it from the top. It was 60 feet high and reportedly was about 4 inches thick. It was a big curtain. Only the Most High could tear it. And he tears it downward as if reaching from heaven to humanity. And look what happened simultaneously. A tree, talking about the stake that Yeshua was crucified on, a press, his body being crushed, and a veil, his flesh, all three gardens are speaking here at once. Hebrews 10 makes the connection explicit. His flesh is the veil, now torn open, so that we may enter the holy place with confidence. I'm going to read that. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Yeshua, by a new and living way, which he has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. And he did that as a high priest, by the way. So that takes us all the way back to Eden. That was the Father's purpose at this moment, was to bring us as his creation back into fellowship with him, which gave us free access because of it was free to us. It wasn't free to Yeshua. He was bruised. He was crushed for our iniquity. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We were healed. All that happened when that veil was torn from the top to the bottom as Yeshua was on that cross. So the exile from Eden ends here. The cherubim step aside. The way to the tree of life is open again. And Revelation 22 will tell us we will eat from it, the tree of life. So from the tree through the press and past the veil, this is the whole story in 3 places. Eden asked, will you trust Yah? We answered no. Gethsemane answers. A second Adam steps in to a second garden and says yes for us. The Holy of Holies receives the answer. The veil tears, the cherubim part, and the door that was shut in Genesis 3 stands open in Matthew 27. And here is the invitation Hebrews makes from these very 3 places. Let us draw near. Not you may stand at a distance, but draw near. In my congregation, in my hometown, when they're doing communion, that's one of the phrases that they say. You who have repented of your sins and intend to lead a new life, draw near. Well, we're able to do that in that so-called communion ceremony is a representation of acknowledging what the precious life and death and resurrection of Yeshua on our behalf did. We are able to have communion with the Father once again in the garden. We don't have to wait for an annual visit by a priest. We don't have to bring an animal. The way is open through the tree, through the press, beyond the veil. So I have a question for you. Which garden are you currently standing in? Speaking spiritually, are you hiding in Eden like the man and the woman were? Sweating in Gethsemane, or at least understanding what was going on at the olive press? Or are we stepping past that torn veil and coming boldly before the throne of grace? Whichever it is, the invitation is the same. Draw near. That's what the Father has for us as his children. Father, bless you and keep you. Father, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Father, lift up his countenance upon you